some variation of help make giant corporations make more money. Big multinational corporations have no loyalty to our nation. They say quite openly their loyalty is to their shareholders, and about 40% of the shareholders of publicly traded companies aren't Americans. These multinational corporations pursue profits, even if those profits come at a cost to American workers or to our environment. It is not the job of the United States government to work to boost profits of big multinationals that have no particular loyalty to the United States. Instead, the goal of economic competition should be to make our domestic economy strong and to raise the standard of living for the American people. That means investing in American jobs and American workers. And here's the best part. If we give American workers the tools they need, they can compete with anyone, including global economic rivals like China. Economic competition is also political competition. Fair competition can produce and spread the best ideas. We have a chance to show China and the whole world that an American approach that invests in and empowers workers is the most effective way to compete. There are two aspects of global competitiveness that I'd like to focus on in this hearing. The first is that in order to compete in a global economy, American workers need to have a fair set of trade rules, which they do not have right now. Our existing trade rules have undercut our workers, promoted offshoring, and a global race to the bottom in labor and environmental standards. And that is because for decades, the U.S. Trade Representative has represented big multinational corporations, while workers, environmentalists, and other parts of the diverse American economy were pushed to the side, with their interests and concerns given second-class status. That needs to stop. U.S. trade policy needs structural reforms to ensure that it reflects the interests of all Americans, not just a handful of corporations trying to maximize short-term profits. The second reason why workers are struggling against international competition is that we have failed to make critical domestic investments in our workforce. We know that American workers, given the right tools, can outcompete China and every other country in the world. China offers a clear counter approach. It fundamentally devalues and disempowers its workers by barring them from organizing, by pressing ethnic minorities into forced labor camps, by making migrant workers second-class citizens, and by leaving working families to go it alone on childcare. This has helped China cut production costs in the short term, but there are long-term costs. The Chinese government recognizes that such an approach cannot build an innovative workforce, a strong middle class, or sustainable economic growth. Now China is desperately trying to invest in its human capital to fuel development, especially given its aging population, recognizing that these investments are crucial to China's future. This is the moment for the United States to step up. We can and we must do better for our workers. It is the right thing to do, it is the competitive thing to do, and it is the only way to build a strong future for our nation and our people. Specifically, our investments in green technology should center on good jobs and building top-quality workforce. My Build Green and Buy Green bills would do exactly that. These bills and other clean energy investments with strong labor provisions should be included in the infrastructure package that Congress is working on now. Doing so is good for the environment, good for the economy, good for workers and their families. Similarly, we need to give American workers the security they need to be able to do their jobs and care for their families. Universal, high-quality, affordable childcare and early education is an investment in our current and our future workforce. working parents and their children, and a far better way to compete with China than endless expansion of our spending on the U.S. military. We need $700 billion for childcare in the infrastructure bill. It is a critical way to improve our global economic competitiveness. Finally, I was glad to see President Biden's executive order last week, which takes critical steps to promote competition, strengthen antitrust enforcement, and tackle consolidation and anti-competitive practices. Reigniting competition will make markets work better for American families and workers at the same time that it bolsters U.S. competitiveness. I'm looking forward to discussing these issues today and working with my colleagues and the administration to make sure that America's workers can compete in a global economy. Next, I will turn to the ranking member, Senator Cassidy, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair Warren. Thank you to all the witnesses. We were having a mini hearing before Chair Warren spoke up, and if just based on the mini hearing, it's going to be very interesting, but I thank you all. We together are just concerned about how does the United States and the rest of the world deal with China, which has many advantages, talented people, large economy, but is quite willing to, how to put it, break, defy, ignore international norms of behavior, and in so doing achieves a competitive advantage over other countries which choose to acknowledge those international norms of behavior. So strengthening U.S. competitiveness in the face of a country willing to do something such as that is something which should unite all Americans. And it is our responsibility in Congress to defend our nation's workers, citizens, and interests. So, common ground. We all recognize that China has been acting with impunity and in part because countries around the world have been unwilling to act. But nonetheless, we suffer the consequences. There should be a robust discussion about China's role as a primary source of the fentanyl that flows into the United States, killing tens of thousands of Americans every year, about counterfeit medical products and other goods that put Americans' health and lives at risk, like the counterfeit PPE that flooded customs facilities during the pandemic. We should examine China's surveillance efforts and the potential for that to grow internationally as countries around the world are encouraged to use Chinese-developed equipment for 5G networks and other things. We should also look at China's government-backed and operated blockchain-based service network, as well as their collection of vast amounts of genetic material. Another thing of interest is that China right now poses the greatest global threat to climate change. China's massive carbon emissions for every year since 2012 have exceeded the combined U.S. and European Union carbon emissions. Combined, put together, China's exceeds. China continues to build, and although China is committed to lowering their emissions, peaking out at 2030, they have continued to build outdated and polluting coal-fired power plants throughout the developing world, if you will, exporting a problem. A particular point of concern is China's blatant dismissal of international trade rules and compliance with standard labor and environmental practices. Chairwoman Warren has mentioned forced labor. We could also speak of forced child labor and the absence of workers' rights. The United States does not have a trade agreement with China, so there's no standards for environmental or worker protections such as those that exist in the USMCA or the CAFTA-DR. So in a sense, that serves to lower the cost of production in China relative to those countries. Put differently, the cost of compliance that Mexico and CAFTA-DR countries have to invest for environmental and labor protections, China does not, lowering their cost of production. If you will, it incentivizes companies to move to China away from those countries. I can't say it's causally related, but it's temporally related, that between 2017 and 2019, China's foreign direct investment inflow increased from 136 billion to 141 billion. And in the same period, the 6 CAFTA nations saw FDI inflows decrease from 9.7 to 8.4. Once more, the cost of compliance inherent in USMCA and CAFTA puts these trading partners at risk. We need to think about how to adjust to that. We try and build economies in Central America that would keep folks in Central America as opposed to migrating here. And yet, paradoxically, the standards that we ask them to employ, which we should ask them to employ, raise the cost of production and once more are an incentive for companies to move operations to China. There is so much more to discuss, but at this point I'll turn it over to our witnesses. I look forward to those that are here and those that will be participating online. And once more, thank you, Chair Warren.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Cassidy. So we have a great set of witnesses here today to share their views on U.S. competitiveness. I appreciate all of you being with us. First, joining us virtually, we have the Honorable Dr. William Spriggs, who is a professor of economics at Howard University and chief economist at the AFL-CIO, as well as former Assistant Secretary of Labor for Policy. Dr. Spriggs is a leading expert on many critical issues for American workers, including workforce discrimination, national and international labor standards, and the unequal impacts of trade. Second, we have Roy Houseman, Legislative Director for the United Steelworkers. Mr. Houseman has been standing up for American workers for decades, including as a part of the USW's Legislative and Policy Department since 2011, and previously as president for USW Local 885 in Missoula, Montana. Third, we have Dr. Mary Gallagher, who is the Amy and Alan Lowenstein Professor in Democracy, Democratization, and Human Rights at the University of Michigan. Dr. Gallagher is an expert in Chinese labor issues, as well as Chinese politics, law, and society. Joining us remotely, we also have Yaya Fanuzi, who is an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security. His research focuses on the national security implications of cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology. Next, we have Dr. David Luna, who is Executive Director of the International Coalition Against Illicit Economies of the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at George Mason University. Dr. Luna is a former U.S. diplomat and a national security official with expertise and experience in transnational crime and illicit trade. And lastly, Jane Nakano joins us virtually. Ms. Nakano is a senior fellow in the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Her research interests include U.S. energy policy and energy security and climate issues in the Asia-Pacific region. Economic competition from China presents serious challenges for American workers and businesses, but it also presents a call to action. We have an historic opportunity right now to invest in American workers and American families. In other words, to invest in U.S. competitiveness. So I want to thank you all for being here with us today. I look forward to hearing your testimony. We're going to ask everyone to hold themselves to 5 minutes. You're always welcome to submit longer remarks in writing. Dr. Spriggs, can we start with you?
Can I just interrupt
Please, of course.
We have votes at 2:35. So how are we going to, we should inform everybody
Right.
how we're going to handle that.
So we're going to have the ranking member and I will trade out. One of us will go and the other will have the gavel, and we'll make it through as quick as we can. We'll find out how fast you move through the halls. And we'll try to both be here, but we may be moving in and out.
Sounds good.
All right, good. Thank you very much. And now, Dr. Spriggs, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Good. You are recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chair Warren and Ranking Member Cassidy, for this invitation to give testimony before your committee today on the issue of our nation's competitiveness. I'm happy to offer this testimony on behalf of the AFL-CIO, America's House of Labor, representing the working people of the United States, and based on my expertise as a professor in Howard University's Department of Economics. My testimony today will discuss gaps in U.S. infrastructure compared to our leading trading partners. Many of these gaps do not require federal fiscal resources, but do require updating our institutions and legal structures to meet the challenges of the 21st century. The current crisis of the COVID pandemic highlight our needs to improve. While Congress has reacted swiftly and admirably with aid to support the economy, on many dimensions, the U.S. was less resilient than our leading trading partners and is set to have major challenges ahead that we can avoid. Because of Congress and now the leadership of President Biden, the American Rescue Plan has been well received by those who compare global economic activity. The International Monetary Fund and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development revised their forecast upward for this year and next based on the passage of the ARP. And given the importance of the U.S. economy to global economic growth, this changed their optimism for a faster global recovery. Yet they both still see a full recovery more than a year away. Thanks to the rapid deployment of vaccines in the U.S., American hospitalization and death rates from COVID plummeted, and after being far above the rest of our trading partners, we have finally now surpassed them and having lower rates of severe outcomes from COVID. That has allowed U.S. economic activity to accelerate, and boy, the ARP support of American households helped accelerate job growth. But even if we maintain current record-setting pace, we will have a hard time getting back to normal levels. We should shift our focus to lessons learned and make changes to sustain the recovery and make our economy more resilient. Several of the changes that Congress improvised to fix our labor market safety show gaps the U.S. faced relative to our competitors. Our labor market regulations are clearly out of date. The scale at which we needed these institutional changes highlight how on a regular basis the resiliency we need is not present. Among our leading trading partners, we have a lower level of workers covered by collective bargaining agreements. Last year, during the pandemic, while we lost jobs across almost all industries, within industry, relatively more non-union than union jobs were lost, so the share of workers and unions rose. This presence of a collective bargaining agreement helped firms in two ways. One is that firms could retain workers and negotiate to share the responsibility of making decisions on how to adjust hours and pay and safety conditions. The other is that for some industries, like the airlines, management and workers could present a consensus to Congress and policymakers on the best way forward to maintain an orderly slowdown of business and keep maximum flexibility for the fastest restart. Similarly, within the trade context itself, researchers have found that industries with stronger collective bargaining structures led to fewer jobs lost in the face of the China trade shock of this century than in industries with lower union density. When comparing labor market performance of OECD nations, the OECD research shows that stronger central bargaining systems outperform weak systems in wages, employment, and gender and young worker outcomes, primarily because they are better at smoothing economic shocks and reducing inequality. Updating our NLRA to address changes in the workplace since the 1940s, such as passing the PRO Act, is key. Our unemployment insurance system was clearly outdated and overwhelmed. Congress reacted. Several studies showed that the extra benefits did not slow people returning to work, but helped ensure cash balances for all households, and that helped to speed our recovery. A higher minimum wage would make people more resilient. Another shortcoming is that we don't have paid sick days or holidays. This has hurt the labor force participation of women and their recovery. Coupled with our lack of federal policy to ensure childcare, the U.S. stands out for being sixth among the 7 G7 nations for women's labor force participation. With an aging economy, we have to have more workers active, and we need those changes to get women at work. We need to change the global playing field and lead in that. We need a floor for corporate taxation so that we can have all nations provide the health, the labor, and economic support that we need to raise the standards in the world instead of a race to the bottom that hurts the United States. Investing in Americans is necessary, not just investing in our physical infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Spriggs. And I'm going to pause here with our witnesses. We are joined by our chair from the Finance Committee, Senator Wyden, who is recognized for opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Chair Warren, and for this courtesy, and to the ranking member, Senator Cassidy. We all look forward to going after this issue in an aggressive and bipartisan way. It seems to me what is so important about your hearing, Chair Warren, and our work with Senator Cassidy is this is about one basic challenge. America is never going to outcompete China with crumbling roads and bridges and a country full of struggling workers. That is a recipe for decline. And it's exactly what you and I and President Biden want to turn around. That's pretty much what we heard at lunch. And so I very much look forward to your continued leadership on this, because there are a lot of pieces to the puzzle. For example, the link between physical investment and people. And you and I have talked, for example, about this matter of how important it is to invest in roads and bridges and ports, but at the same time, if people don't have childcare, which has been a huge priority for you, then the companies aren't going to have people who can move goods from point A to point B. So I am juggling a lot today, but your ability to integrate these various pieces into a policy that lets us outcompete China is extraordinarily important. Our subcommittee is modest, but with your leadership, I like to think we're mighty, and I want you to know I'm in your camp. We're going to work closely with Senator Cassidy.
Wait, so the ranking member's chopped liver? I mean, you know what I'm saying?
I guess, my wife always says my husband is infamous rather than famous. But with you two, I feel like I'm running with the right crowd, because this is a hugely important subject. It is bipartisan. I'm glad that you wanted to do this, Chair Warren, and that Senator Cassidy has made this a big priority. And I expect that we're going to have lots of hearings like this in the days ahead. I will have questions for the record, Chair Warren, and I thank you for letting me run in here for a quick minute. And to all our guests, we want you to know at the Finance Committee, we very much value your input, and this is not indicative of my manners being boorish on a regular basis. It is just a particularly hectic day. We welcome you. You are in good hands with Chair Warren. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your being here, Chair Wyden. So let's go ahead with our witnesses. Mr. Houseman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
All right. Chairman Warren, Ranking Member Cassidy, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on this important topic. As a former trade-impacted mill worker, now legislative director for United Steelworkers, the largest industrial union in North America, it is an honor to be a voice for organized workers in today's discussion, and our union's international president, Tom Conway, gives his regards. Manufacturing commodities, which Americans and people across the globe use every day, from tissue paper to electric buses, is what our union does, and it provides a unique lens into defending and strengthening U.S. competitiveness. With this in mind, my remarks will focus on 3 strategic efforts: refocusing federal and domestic investments on critical infrastructure, retooling our labor and environmental laws for a 21st century democracy, and exporting not just our goods, but our ideals for a just global economy. Turning first to domestic investments, the USW takes a holistic approach to our country's infrastructure. Right now, steelworker local unions across the country are working with their respective employers in a campaign called We Supply America, urging for infrastructure investment. This campaign emphasizes the critical role USW members play in America's infrastructure supply chain. We are hopeful and anxious to review the details of the $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure framework. We know this new investment is needed when, for example, over 4 million gallons of drinking water is lost from leaking pipes across the country in the time it takes to read my remarks today. We can do better, and with strong Buy America provisions, our members who work at companies like McQuain Pipe, stand ready at the crucible to pour melted iron should Congress make this investment. The union also knows that the U.S. can achieve a net zero emissions economy while maintaining production and employment in energy-intensive, trade-exposed industries. But it will require workers and government and industry working together. The USW is engaged with our employers and community stakeholders to encourage investments in carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, and direct air capture technologies, for example. Domestic investments in infrastructure and industrial capacity will be key to building a 21st century clean economy. But physical infrastructure is really only one piece to a prosperous, equitable, and just democracy. Our human infrastructure needs investment. Take, for example, collective bargaining. According to the Economic Policy Institute, the wage gap between high and middle wage earners between 1979 and 2017 is roughly 1/3 higher because of the deunionization. My written testimony includes several additional examples of human infrastructure, but Congress should start by passing labor law reforms like the PRO Act. Our country will also need to improve our training programs, both dislocated and incumbent workers. We must improve resources available for adult worker training. The U.S. funding for job training programs is among the worst of all 37 countries in the OECD relative to the size of our economy. Public spending is less than half the spending levels of Australia, Canada, and the UK, and 1/6 the level of spending in Germany. Meanwhile, today, a worker who loses their job to unfair practices from China, where we had a $310 billion trade deficit in 2020, cannot get trade adjustment assistance benefits because of a program reversion. This is unacceptable, and a healthy TA reauthorization similar to legislation put forward by Senator Stabenow is needed. As a past recipient of TAA benefits, I know how important this program can be. Lastly, we must build a robust worker-centered trade agenda. Trade policy must play a dual role of defending our communities from unfair trade practices while ensuring the goods and services our workers produce can reach global markets. For example, our members have fought for their jobs in over 100 anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations, and the workers in steel and aluminum manufacturing stand behind the successful Section 232 safeguards. For us, getting trade policy right is a must for jobs. This is vital as China's Belt and Road Initiative has led to expansions of dumped and subsidized goods entering from third-party countries. However, our trade enforcement tools have not yet been upgraded to contain this growing problem. Fortunately, Senator Brown and Portman are leading with a much-needed update to our trade enforcement laws, commonly referred to as Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0 or Senate Bill 1187. Ensuring that U.S. remains competitive while requiring a whole-of-government approach that includes investments in our country's infrastructure requires workers and an ever-evolving trade policy. And USW members are standing ready to make that future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Houseman. Chairwoman Warren has gone to vote. So, Dr. Gallagher, I'll call upon you.
Chair Warren, Ranking Member Cassidy, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss China's...
Is your microphone on? Okay.
I'll move it a little closer. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss China's working conditions and how the United States should develop policies to improve our competitiveness while maintaining our values. I speak today as an expert on China's labor and social policies. These are my own views as a scholar on this topic for over 20 years. As a two-time recipient of a Fulbright Award, I'm deeply aware of the importance of area studies knowledge and language expertise. I hope the United States government will continue to invest in training American students and scholars in area studies and world languages. It is a national security imperative that we maintain and cultivate this expertise. My written testimony highlighted these key findings. Since 2008, China's workplace laws and policies have expanded considerably to improve employment security and access to social insurance. Since 2009, the Chinese government has expanded basic pension and medical insurance to both rural and urban residents. We should not ignore the achievements that China has made. However, in practice, China's laws and policies on the books are weakly and unevenly enforced. They often leave out workers from rural areas, informal workers, and workers in the new digital economy. New social insurance policies based on residency, not employment, are insufficient, offering broad but shallow coverage. Let me expand a bit on the rural-urban divide in China because it is by far the least understood part of the Chinese economy. Rural workers who live in cities without the legal rights to settle there, by and large, are not able to take part in the more generous pensions, medical insurance, and educational opportunities that urban residency promises. While 60% of China's population, over 850 million people, now live in cities, 27%, or 230 million people, are still classified as rural and do not have the legal right to settle permanently, nor will their children, even if they are born in the city. China risks passing on these income, health, and educational inequalities to the next generation, imperiling China's shift to a new development model that is built on domestic demand. Short-term gain by cutting employers' costs risks long-term damage to China's ambitions to become a technologically advanced and innovative economy. Another important inequality is gender equality. Since 1990, Chinese women's labor force participation has dropped from 73%, one of the highest in the world, to 60%. The gap between male and female labor force participation is also widening. Why? It is not because women are choosing not to work. Instead, it is due to two main factors: widespread gender discrimination at the workplace and lack of access to childcare. Gender discrimination is exacerbated by the relaxation of China's one-child policy, which now permits Chinese couples to have up to 3 children. Employers have become much more reluctant to hire women. Childcare that is both affordable and high quality, particularly for infants and toddlers before preschool, is also very scarce in urban China. Rural Chinese women who migrate to cities for work most often leave their children behind in the countryside to be cared for by relatives, which has long-term negative effects on the health and the educational opportunities of Chinese children, of which 2/3 are still born in the countryside. China's demographic crisis has further pushed the Chinese Communist Party to promote women's roles as wives and mothers, but insufficiently protected their rights at the workplace and insufficiently provided access to affordable childcare. In addition to weak enforcement of law, the current government has launched a severe crackdown on civil society, which has impaired Chinese workers' ability to protect themselves. Since 2014, labor NGOs and other activists have been targeted in waves of detentions and social media blackouts to end social mobilization around rights at the workplace, demands for freedom of association, and protection from discrimination. I last testified in front of a congressional subcommittee in 2012, and the difference between now and then is stark. The previous administration in China was far more tolerant of civil society's role in protecting rights at the workplace. But in the current era, civil society has been completely shut down. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Gallagher. Mr. Luna, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chair Warren, Ranking Member Cassidy, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify in today's hearing. It is an honor to be here on behalf of the International Coalition Against Illicit Economies to outline the array of cross-border security threats that China continues to inspire to harm U.S. national security, our competitiveness, and the health and safety of our citizens. The booming criminal markets are fueling a multi-trillion-dollar global economy that undermines U.S. competitive policies. The United Nations has estimated that dirty money laundered from such criminal activities is between 2 to 5% of global GDP. And China is a common denominator in expanding many of these illicit economies. Fentanyl, which is killing tens of thousands of Americans each year, is bought by the Mexican cartels and facilitated by Chinese criminal groups. When the fentanyl illegal trade converges with other criminal activities, the overall threat becomes multiplied many times over, including when China's state-sponsored IP theft and economic espionage of U.S. trade secrets harms our companies at an estimated $600 billion. Similarly, China trades in counterfeits is flooding U.S. markets, accounting for 80 to 90% of all counterfeits seized in the U.S. and globally. The National Association of Manufacturers released a report last year finding that counterfeits sapped the U.S. economy $131 billion and 325,000 jobs in 2019. Across illicit commerce platforms, internet marketplaces, fake goods have increased the health and safety risk to all Americans. During the current pandemic, predatory criminals generated tens of billions of dollars in selling fake PPE, mostly coming from China. The proliferation of counterfeited electronics hurts not only our industry, our electronic industry, but threatens the safety of our troops, including when they have been found to infiltrate critical military systems and supply chains. Every IP-protected product can be counterfeited. This is true for all consumer goods and services, but especially for the footwear and apparel industry, in which American brands are highly counterfeited, such as Nike, Under Armour, Polo, and sportwears from the National Football League, Major League Baseball, NBA, and NHL. Like other forms of illicit trade, the illegal tobacco trade is very profitable for criminal organizations, kleptocratic networks, and terrorist groups. The China Tobacco Corporation is by far the largest cigarette company in the world and produces half of the world's cigarettes, which are moved illicitly through free trade zones and unregulated markets. Auto parts, similarly, coming from China, counterfeit auto parts end up hurting Americans and really are auto companies like Ford, GM, and Tesla. Illegal logging, fishing, and mining of natural resources not only harm our natural world, but contribute to climate change and the financing of other converging threats. Chinese criminals are expanding their ties with the Mexican cartels and other criminals in the US, Canada, and Latin America, diversifying into areas such as human trafficking and environmental crime. China constitutes the biggest money laundering hub in the world, responsible for about half of the world's laundering in the world today. Trade fraud or trade-based money laundering are perfect asymmetrical threat vehicles to transfer money valued by kleptocrats, criminals, and terrorists in the form of trade goods out of the country by importing goods at overvalued prices or exporting goods at undervalued prices. China's Belt Road Initiative footprint tracks some of the biggest illicit trade routes known for corruption, money laundering, and an array of traffic contraband as a conduit for China to expand and bridge a superhighway of illicit economies globally while saddling parts of the developing world with debt traps. Finally, in a call for action, we must heighten the political pressure on China and elevate the global fight against illicit economies in Congress as a national security priority, including through a bipartisan congressional caucus. We must empower law enforcement agencies with new legal authorities and develop a national strategy to combat trade-based money laundering and related supply chain criminal infiltration and market penetration. In closing, China must become a more responsible partner and end the corruptive influence of bad actors exploiting today's illicit economies that are sabotaging legitimate commerce, prosperity, American competitiveness, and the economic growth of nations who play by the global trade system of rules and by the rule of law. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Please, sir, for 5 minutes.
That was on mute.
No, we heard you. You're good.
Oh, okay. Sorry, you were on mute. I didn't hear. Chair Warren, Ranking Member Cassidy, the distinguished members of the subcommittee, and my fellow panelists, it's an honor to participate in today's meeting. Please allow me to add that although I do consulting with the private sector on financial technology issues, my comments today are my personal opinion and are not on behalf of any clients. Today, I'll explain briefly how the Chinese government's recent foray into financial technology, including by investing heavily in blockchain technology and piloting a central bank digital currency, is a long-term strategy to dominate the digital economy of the future. This strategy is a new financial dimension to the great power competition between China and the United States. But it is about more than money or currency. It's really about data. Specifically, it's about which country will be most successful at leveraging data for technical innovation to set the standards for the new global financial infrastructure and become the anchor for the information revolution that is on the horizon. No one entity or nation technically owns the underlying infrastructure of the internet. However, it can't be denied that the United States' decades-long investment in building it enabled U.S. companies to lead the technological and business growth that arose out of the internet's information revolution. The clearest example now of China working to upend America's economic dominance on the internet is its blockchain-based service network, or BSN. It's a state-driven project that has partnered with Chinese private tech firms to build what the Chinese Communist Party calls or believes is the next generation of internet infrastructure. The BSN, like the US endeavor to build the original internet, is a decades-long campaign. The BSN vision is an internet environment where data transmits through distributed broadcasting in which separate applications and business systems can simultaneously access and operate on agreed upon authenticated data. This contrasts with the current internet process, where data is siloed between different systems and moves through the internet in a linear fashion. In theory, this upgraded internet would enable an Internet of Things where all digital things can communicate and transact with each other, enabling a new era of digital innovation and economic possibilities. But it would be an internet where China owns the underlying infrastructure. Although it's commonly said now that data is the new oil, it is more accurate probably to say that the Chinese government sees data as the new electricity. Like electricity, data in China is becoming the force to power all applications and economic processes in the country, with individual users and their devices connected to national infrastructure. The disruptive potential of the BSN is similar to risks to the United States around China's digital currency electronic payment, which is a decentralized central bank money project popularly known as the ECNY, or the digital yuan. The ECNY is unlikely to displace the US dollar as the top international reserve currency in the short term, or give China an immediate buffer against US sanctions power. The risk, though, for U.S. displacement comes from the upper hand that China might gain in the long term by developing cross-border financial transaction infrastructure that a significant group of other countries eventually adopt. Data certainly is becoming the new electricity, but not just in China. Big data, machine learning, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, they're all driving technological innovation in most advanced economies. The world is becoming more, not less, dependent on data moving through the internet. This trend is leading to a oneness of data that would appear to power almost every aspect of our public and private lives. At a time when advanced economies appear to be near the precipice of a fully digitized existence, now may be the best time for the US to assert rules of the road for the increasing role of data in our lives. The first step is to accept the inevitability of this technological advancement in data transmission while managing its societal shape. China's preemptive strategy to gain a prominence in blockchain-based broadcast transmission of data is a wake-up call for U.S. innovation. The oneness of data does not have to be a tool of tyranny and dehumanization if it is molded by the principles of America's founding. Policymakers, business people, and other stakeholders must consider a framework for participating in this data revolution in a way that fits with the U.S. Constitution. Here are a few recommendations for how the U.S. can lead the next data revolution. One, the National Science Foundation should fund a decentralized internet sandbox for colleges and universities. Two, the Small Business Administration, through its Small Business Innovation Research Program, should offer grants to U.S. businesses for fintech R&D that supports both privacy and national security concerns. Three, the United States Federal Reserve should expand its research of central bank digital currencies. And four, the Security and Exchanges Commission should give more regulatory clarity around digital assets and blockchain technology. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions and our discussion.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your being with us virtually. And now we have our last witness, Ms. Nakano. I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Chair Warren, Ranking Member Cassidy, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss the rise of China's competitiveness in energy technology sectors and their environmental and climate implications. China's emergence as a globally competitive force in energy technology sectors is a complex and evolving story. Despite this country's 2060 carbon neutrality commitment, China continues to be the largest producer and consumer of coal. What's more, China is a major financier and exporter of high carbon energy projects in the world. Since 2000, China's two global policy banks have financed over $51.6 billion worth of coal projects globally. In 2020, The share of coal still accounted for 27% of China's global energy financing under the Belt and Road Initiative. A combination of the desire of the Chinese government to address excess manufacturing capacity at home, the capacity of leading Chinese policy banks to support coal-fired power plant exports, as well as a wave of coal finance bans and restrictions by multilateral development banks and Western governments have propelled Chinese banks to become a major source of financing for coal-fired power plants in the world. Unlike its peers in the advanced industrialized countries, China's leading policy banks are not obligated to abide by the OECD restrictions governing coal power finance. In fact, these official Chinese institutions merely subject their coal financing to existing host market environmental regulations. At the same time, China has become a leading exporter of clean energy technology components. In solar PV value chains, China leads the world in several key segments, including polysilicon and wafer manufacturing. China's presence is less dominant in the wind power supply chains, but China is home to roughly half of the global manufacturing capacity for key wind power components. Moreover, today, China is not only the largest EV market in the world, but also a leading producer of key EV components, such as cathodes, anodes, and separators that are then turned into battery cells. A key factor underpinning China's competitiveness in these clean energy technologies is its commanding position along the supply chains for rare earth elements, other minerals, and metals that are vital to these technologies. China has cultivated its mineral wealth and developed mid and downstream capabilities through various industrial policies. China's preeminence in the mineral supply chains has come with a high environmental cost, however. The mining and processing of rare earth elements use a variety of chemical substances, and these activities with limited environmental protections until the mid-2010s have led to some known accounts of environmental and health damages in China. Lastly, nuclear energy is also a sector where China is emerging as a global technology supplier following a remarkable expansion of its domestic nuclear power generation fleet during the last decade. China plans to expand its nuclear power fleet to 70 gigawatts by 2025, becoming the second largest in the world, only behind the United States. China is pursuing multiple deals in the world in the effort to become a global leader in nuclear power by combining good enough technologies with attractive financing that are, again, outside the bounds of OECD regulations. More needs to be done to address China's financing practices for energy exports that have market distorting effects against cleaner energy sources and technologies, as well as energy technologies that are manufactured by advanced industrialized democracies like the United States. Also, while China's contribution to reducing the costs of low emission technologies is undeniable, their practices in mining and processing minerals that are key to clean energy technology warrant closer evaluation from the environmental, social, and governance perspectives. Concurrently, our over-reliance on Chinese supplies of these minerals and metals needs to be remedied. Fundamentally, however, the United States needs to do more to enhance its energy technology competitiveness. Being competitive in energy technology sectors means preserving a strong innovation ecosystem, rebuilding manufacturing base, and securing supply chains. Moreover, being competitive in clean energy technology sectors is not simply about doing our share in reducing emissions. These technologies are no longer niche, and they already account for hundreds of billions of dollars in investment and consumer spending, with strong outlook for further growth. The endeavor, therefore, has a strategic value to our nation, as competitive clean energy sectors can augment the U.S. position in the global economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Nakano. I appreciate your testimony here. So I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. American workers are the foundation of U.S. competitiveness. When we empower our workers, they drive innovation, productivity, and sustainable economic growth. Investing in workers should be the core of our domestic agenda and our trade agenda. Too often, trade rules undercut workers, which promote offshoring and a global race to the bottom in labor and environmental standards. That is not an accident. That is a policy choice. For decades, workers and other activists have been systematically shut out of U.S. trade policy. while big corporations have bought and lobbied their way into writing our trade rules. Now, back in 2001, the U.S. Trade Representative, the federal agency that's in charge of our nation's trade policy, spent years negotiating a trade deal that enabled China to join the WTO and lock in permanent preferential access to the U.S. market for China. So I want to talk a little bit about how that trade agreement worked. Dr. Gallagher, let me start with you. Before joining the WTO, China had to agree to a bunch of commitments that the United States spent years negotiating. So I want to ask you about those commitments. Did these commitments include enforceable labor protections, like requiring that China allow free independent unions, or that China prohibit forced labor?
Thank you, Senator Warren, for the question. China's accession to WTO did not require any commitments regarding labor protections that were enforceable. Most labor issues were either kicked up to the International Labor Organization, the ILO, which does not have strong levers to induce countries to comply with international labor conventions, or they were kicked down to companies to engage in private regulation, such as corporate social responsibility protocols or accreditation by different non-governmental organizations, such as the Fair Labor Association, which have had limited impact. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was put forward by the Obama administration but never realized, and of which China was not a member, did try to include stricter labor protections and requirements for freedom of association with Vietnam, a communist country with a similar trade union structure to China's. So that would have been an interesting case, but as you know, the U.S. pulled out of the TPP in 2017.
So what you're telling me is, while they might have been able to negotiate something, that when the negotiations were finished in 2001, instead of making sure that American workers could compete on a level playing field, the U.S. Trade Representative worked with corporate lobbyists to make offshoring U.S. manufacturing jobs to China as cheap as possible and as easy as possible. And that meant lots of profits for multinational corporations that wanted to build new Chinese factories that ran on cheap labor, but it meant zero protections for Chinese workers because that would have raised labor costs for those companies. These new rules meant that investing in Chinese factories was a whole lot more attractive than investing in U.S. factories. And it was a lot cheaper then to buy Chinese imports instead of buying things that were made here in the United States. This had a big impact on American manufacturing communities, as well as a disproportionate impact on Black workers. Dr. Spriggs, let me ask you, how many U.S. manufacturing workers lost their jobs due to increased imports from China, and how did this impact Black communities in particular?
Thank you for the question. Our best estimates now show 6 million jobs and manufacturing loss for the United States. My work shows a little over 1 million lost for Black Americans. This disproportionate impact on local labor markets led to other job losses, so that there were many communities that lost jobs, total jobs, and lowered the share of workers employed in those communities, a lasting impact from which we have not recovered, even with the expansion from the Great Recession.
So 6 million lost jobs from this negotiated trade agreement that was great for multinational corporations, just not good for Chinese workers, and definitely not good for American workers. I really appreciate your important scholarship, Dr. Spriggs. Now, we have a federal program called the Trade Adjustment Assistant to help workers who lose their jobs because of trade deals, if those trade deals are helping our economy overall. That's the idea behind it. We should renew it, update it to make sure it's adequately helping Black and brown workers. But let's face it, a program like this is a drop in the ocean. We should be addressing workers' concerns at the beginning when a trade policy is negotiated, not trying to pay them off once they lose their jobs and their communities have been destroyed. Mr. Houseman, there's a labor advisory committee that's supposed to represent workers' interests. So I actually just want to go through some questions about this. How much power does this committee really have as part of the trade negotiations? So, for example, when the U.S. trade rep finalized the 2001 trade deal with China, did the labor negotiators get to have a sign-off on the final version of the bill? Did the Labor Advisory Committee get a chance to weigh in on that?
No, Senator. They provide advice and comment, but at the end of the day, it really isn't a meaningful, there's no ability to really stop the process for labor's voice.
Okay, so the committee was not permitted to weigh in on this. Let me ask you about another one. How about the workers themselves? Was the draft text of the deal ever published so workers could see it before it was actually adopted?
Effectively, no. It's really hard for workers, rank and file members, to see draft text of trade agreements.
Okay, so not the Labor Committee that's supposed to be watching out during these negotiations for labor, not the workers themselves. How about someone else? Did the U.S. Trade Rep or any other agency have to do any kind of analysis about how the deal would affect different groups of workers differently, for example, by race or by region in the country?
Yeah, if you look at like the International Trade Commission that just recently did a report on our trade agreements and highlighted a very modest growth, less than 1% from these trade agreements. But there was while at the same time highlighting significant job loss in manufacturing. And then when you really dive through the report, there is no language about communities of color, minority communities, or quite frankly, like communities that experience high levels of poverty. Mm-hmm. I think about a lot of our manufacturing plants. About 10 out of our 13 tire plants, for example, are in communities where the poverty rate exceeds the national poverty rate.
Wow.
So, these manufacturing plants are key employers for a lot of these workers. And so these trade agreements, as you've explained, without this ability to really review them and have worker input and have good analysis for you all to make a firm decision, should we enter into these trade agreements?
So thank you. That's very powerful testimony, and I appreciate the help on this and the data. I'm glad that the Biden administration is saying all the right things about putting labor, environmental, and equity issues at the center of our trade policy. But if we want trade deals to work for everyone, not just for big corporations, it's not enough to say we're going to put this on one president. We need to make structural changes to the trade policy-making process to ensure that workers are meaningfully represented at the negotiating table, both now and in all future trade deals. So thank you very much. Thank you. Ranking Member Cassidy, would you like to ask some questions?
Absolutely, thank you. Dr. Gallagher, you mentioned the demographic issues in China, and I noticed that I saw some statistics which suggested that they had underreported the number of COVID deaths, that the population actually maybe even went down a little bit, and the number of births actually also decreased. I've also read that you mentioned how women have a difficult time having the same progress in the workforce, but nonetheless, many women work. And so for them to take off from work and have a child, it would take 20 years for that child to enter the workforce. So some have suggested that they've really begun a bad phase of their demographic period, that as soon as 20 years from now, we could begin to see a dramatically smaller Chinese population. Would you agree with all that?
Yeah, that's a correct
microphone, please.
Yeah, that's a correct understanding of the problem, both the demographic.
Is your microphone on, or is it my bad ears?
It says it's on.
Okay, pull it a little bit closer, please.
That's a correct summary of the demographic crisis that China is facing today, related both to the decline in the percentage of the working population, the very low fertility rates, and then the rapid aging, such that by 2050, without changes, which are very hard to achieve in a short period of time, the population of Beijing, the capital of China, could be 50% over people 65 and older. So China is...
And in terms of absolute numbers, what, the 1.2 billion people now?
1.4.
1.4? If current trends continue, what would be their population in 2050?
We believe, although I'm not a demographer, so I don't want to get my numbers wrong, but we believe that the Chinese population will begin to shrink in absolute terms over the course of this century.
Now, that's very vague.
Well, I mean, I think one way to think about China's population problems is that is a country with a lot of people, right? It's still the most populated country in the world, although India will soon surpass it. But it's more the demographic, the structure of the population.
I get that.
Balance.
The older versus the younger. But in terms of absolute numbers, it would also be much smaller, correct?
Over a longer period of time, yes. It's also imbalanced in terms of its
Male-female.
sex ratio as well.
Which presumably also affects birth rates.
Exactly.
Okay. And I didn't pick up until your testimony that there's a rural-urban divide. If you will, the rural area has less potential to be productive.
Yeah, the rural area traditionally was agriculture, and starting in the reform period, what started to happen is that hundreds of millions of people who are rural residents in China left the city.
I understand that. They've migrated in.
Right.
But at the same time, even given that, there is still a difference in access to services and education such that people in the rural area, you could, and particularly those who are in the informal economy, you could almost say would be mired in a substandard level of living. So when we speak about their productive workforce, it is even worse than you might imagine given their demographic challenges. There's also this rural-urban divide, which leaves a whole segment less productive.
Right, and those rural people, many hundreds of millions of them are in the cities, but their status is still related back to their birthplace, and that's very difficult to change unless you're very, very highly educated. And so for most people who are born in the countryside, even if you migrate to an urban area and live there for a long time.
Because I have limited time, so I don't mean to keep interrupting you, but some of this I've read your testimony, I have a sense that I know. There's been some who have said that despite everything we've spoken about with all these excellent witnesses as regards the advantages of China, that their demography is destiny, and that it will be difficult for them to overcome their demographic challenges if we're speaking over the 30-year period or 50-year period. Do you have a sense of that?
The concern is that that population, which is still a large percentage of the population, will be left behind because they do not have the same advantages, particularly in education.
But I'm speaking now in terms of U.S.-Chinese competitiveness, that their competitiveness will be undermined by this demographic challenge, and we're speaking over the next 4 or 5 decades.
Certainly.
You agree with that?
Yes, I do agree with it, but I also don't think that the Chinese government is unaware of it, and they do try to address it.
But there's only so much you can do to coax people to have children, particularly when your male-female ratio is out of balance. Mr. Luna, I think I've read that as much as $1 billion a day flows out of China in terms of capital flight. Is that just a figure I vaguely remember, or is there any, what is their capital flight issue?
I think that's correct. There's been numerous international organizations who have put those estimates, and they could be conservative estimates.
Really? Now, you speak about trade-based money laundering. I'm very concerned about that. It seems as if trade-based money laundering is a way that somebody can move capital from China to a country outside of China, and under, if you will, avoiding Chinese government scrutiny, et cetera. So if you will, their participation in the TBML is not necessarily to further criminal activity, but to get their capital out. Is that possible?
That's a fair assessment, Senator. Going back to your earlier question, if you look at the proceeds of corruption since 1995, they're up to $2 trillion. In my testimony earlier, I mentioned that China's money laundering hub up to 1.5 to $2 trillion a year.
$2 trillion a year. Now, the Chinese government is a surveillance society. I guess I'm a little bit, how are they so incapable of capturing what might be a conservative estimate of $1 billion of capital flight per day?
Good question, Senator. It's a little bit complex there. I think the issue of complicity is part of the challenge.
Now, complicity in terms of a corrupt official or in terms of official?
Correct. Not necessarily at the national. It could very be a disconnect between the national and the subnational corrupt officials in the various provinces across China. In fact, that's where you see often the high level of corruption in China.
So although we see many things that China does as threatening to the West, this is actually an area that we could potentially, I think you highlight in this your testimony, an area that we could potentially cooperate on, which is to address the trade-based money laundering aspect of, which would address in turn their concern about capital flight. Is that a fair statement?
Correct. I do think political pressure by the Congress, the Biden administration working together, bringing China to the table. If you just look at the various illicit markets and weave them together, China, again, is the common denominator and the major player in the global illegal economy.
I'll come back to that because I think it's Chair Warren's turn. I'm a few minutes over. Can I go? So then let me ask, because it seems like we have a tension here. On the one hand, they export more, albeit counterfeit goods, which helps their economy. On the other hand, this may be a vehicle by which there's capital flight. Is there a tension there, or am I only imagining it?
Well, there's illicit trade, but on the illicit trade, they do exploit illicit trade to move capital flight. And to move criminally derived proceeds.
So even though it's illicit goods, they're just mismatching the pricing between the recipient country and China in order to move capital out.
Correct. It could be overvaluation, undervaluation, or mispricing. Correct.
So the Chinese government would, in that case, they're savvy enough to evade the Chinese government surveillance, correct?
The complicit corrupt officials, correct.
Okay. And then I'm through with you, and then we'll come back. I'll ask our other witness about a way to address that.
So I would like to talk for a minute about climate change. Climate change poses an existential threat to every living thing on this planet. The United States should be racing to make investments in green technology, green products, green infrastructure, so that we are prepared and so that our economy grows as the rest of the world needs these products to fight climate change. If we fail to act, then we will spend the coming decades relying on China and other countries to sell us the things that we need to fight climate change, and we will cut U.S. workers out of the jobs of the future. China is already making these investments, seeking to combat pollution and to dominate new sectors. They're throwing the book at the problem. They're funding basic research, they're subsidizing commercialization of new technologies, and they're using government purchasing power to help new products gain a foothold in their market. Because China understands that the private sector can't do this alone. So they're putting a lot of government muscle behind making this happen. Dr. Spriggs, do the necessary comprehensive investments in green technology get made without help from the federal government?
Thank you, Senator. No, they would not. There's too much policy uncertainty to make the size of investment in the type of research that needs to be taking place, and the fact that recouping the gains, which will be massive in transforming other elements of the economy, make it unlikely that individual firms would make the investment on the scale we need.
Okay.
So we really need the government signal and the government support to help companies make those investments.
Okay. So that's a powerful point. It's important to understand what it takes to get a market like this up and running, and it's not that we've got an open field. China's actually already moving into this market very aggressively. You know, China recognizes, I think, this challenge and the opportunity that it presents. So it's using every policy tool it can to develop and deploy green technologies. But China's approach is missing one key thing: meaningful protection for workers. And that means that China can cut costs of factory production, but it also means that the Chinese workforce is poorer, it's less educated, it's less productive, and it is less innovative. Mr. Houseman, right now, Congress is debating making historic investments in clean technology. So I just want to ask you, if we follow China's model, that is, we make the investments in research, but we don't make the investments in workers and protecting our workers, what do you think happens?
I believe, you know, when you look at 70% of the gross domestic product in the U.S. is U.S. consumers. It's U.S. workers that are putting this effort together, you know, using their purchasing power to grow the economy. And that means that you need to have good labor standards, right? Like I think of Joe Rona, who testified before the Senate Finance Committee hearing, he had this opportunity where he was working at a Globe that made a subcomponent to polysilicate, and unfortunately lost his job to that. They made $70,000 to $100,000 a year with a good labor contract. And so when we think about these green investments, if we get our labor standards, which are historically really low and undermined after years and decades of adverse court cases and efforts to undermine collective bargaining, there's this opportunity to like renew our green infrastructure, but we also have to renew our human infrastructure, our labor rights.
Yeah, I think this is a really powerful point. It's something I want us to all drive home and triple underline, that engaging in a race to the bottom with China on labor conditions does not make America more competitive. It undercuts our nation's greatest competitive advantage, our hardworking, skilled, innovative workforce. So this is the reason that I introduced the Buy Green Act with Congressman Andy Levin, which would require that the U.S. government spend at least $1.5 trillion of the money it spends anyway to buy materials and equipment over the next decade, to use that money to purchase American-made, clean, renewable, emission-free energy products. This bill includes robust labor protections ranging from Buy America application to better wage standards to paid leave. Too often, though, labor protections are just an afterthought on domestic investments, and I think that's the wrong approach. We need to think about U.S. workers not at the end of the process, but at the beginning of the process. So let me ask you, Mr. Houseman, if we applied a minimum framework of labor protections across the board to our domestic investments, would that strengthen our global competitiveness?
Oh, absolutely, Senator. I mean, when you already start for such a low base, like we have some basic protections out there, such as Davis-Bacon, prevailing wage, these sorts of provisions that help kind of certain industries. But when we start to talk about expanding labor access and labor rights for workers, it broadens that base. It creates that opportunity for workers to collectively bargain for those opportunities for, you know, healthcare, childcare, these things that we talk about endlessly here around the Capitol. But it is an opportunity where we start from a low base, but with the right policy tools, we can really make the U.S. worker not only just competitive, but competitive with an ability to, you know, thrive. And I think that that's a key piece of what you're trying to do. Yeah.
So I love this. You know, it's fair wages, it's Davis-Bacon, it's childcare, fair labor standards, the ability to have a collective bargaining agreement, that all of those help strengthen our workers. And when we help strengthen our workers, we help make our country more competitive. As you know, President Biden has called for historic investments in the green economy, and that is great, but it is critical that Congress guarantee that those investments create good jobs, jobs that sustain families, jobs that sustain communities for decades to come. It's not just the right thing to do, it is how we retain our competitive advantage against China. So thank you very much. Senator Whitehouse, are you with us?
I am with you, Chairman Warren.
I recognize you for your questions.
Thank you very much. Let me start, if I may, with Ms. Nakano and ask, well, right off the bat, what are your or the Center for Strategic International Studies positions on how important climate action is and what your favored climate policy is with respect to climate action?
Thank you very much, Senator. I can only speak for, I'm not allowed to speak for the center. I mean, we are bipartisan policy think tank with a diverse, yes, yeah, if I may, thank you. I do think that all these economies that do have means really need to electrify as many sectors as possible while decarbonizing power sources as quickly as we can. And in that mix, I think there are many technologies that are both new, but then also some are very proven technologies that merit closer appreciation for some of the low carbon emitting profiles, such as nuclear, for example. But also there is a robust role for renewable energy sources. And
can I ask you if a price on carbon emissions is a policy tool that would be helpful in achieving those goals?
Yes, I believe so.
And you said something really interesting in your testimony about electric vehicles, which is that China is beginning to establish a commanding position. As you know, the president's proposal with respect to climate is a very big push in the electric vehicle space. What advice would you have for us as we try to refine that policy in the U.S. electric vehicles market to try to protect against that commanding position of China's?
Yes, thank you for that question. So China is not really there yet. I think the high capacity and EV sectors, there's no clear winner yet. Some of the things that China has not done so well include, some of the technology advancements they've been working at. They haven't really achieved, but they have been able to give more clear signal on both the pace of infrastructure development, EV charging stations, but then also type of technical specifications that investors need to be able to go in, but then also clear demand. And what's looking at the sort of the U.S. Recent endeavor, I think we also really need to address the supply chain side as well. When it comes to EV sector, as opposed to, let's say, the solar PV or wind, China really does not have the absolute dominance on minerals and metals that go into it. For example, when we look at the lithium ion battery based EVs, countries like Australia and also Chile have lithium. However, China has invested quite heavily in processing and separation capacities for the last couple of decades.
So protect our supply chain would be an important piece of advice.
Yes, and I'd like to see the
running down on time. So if I may, with appreciation, Ms. Nakano, for your answers, turn to it'll be the same question to Mr. Spriggs and Mr. Houseman. We are hearing an awful lot in this committee about the tax advantages of companies when they offshore, when they send jobs and equipment and manufacturing overseas. And as a result of that, they pay no or little tax. And as a result of that, they are able to become more competitive. And that's basically the argument for defending tax advantage for offshoring manufacturing. What the argument fails to consider, in my view, and this is where I want your comment, is that those big offshore companies aren't just competing against foreign companies, they're also competing against American businesses, American companies, American manufacturers who either don't have the scale or don't have the unpatriotic nature to move their manufacturing overseas for tax advantage. And could you focus a little bit on that competitive disadvantage that American businesses suffer when we accommodate and indulge offshoring advantages for big American corporations? That's absolutely correct, Senator, that issue that you raised, because it's unfair to the domestic manufacturer who, when they increase production, are doing it to export. And it's unfair to the host countries around the world that are low income, do not have leverage with major corporations, and can't get the revenues to enforce their labor standards. It's a lose-lose all the way around if we don't have an agreement on a global minimum tax for corporations. We lose, and we lose by setting up a set of rules that ensure a race to the bottom by making sure that other nations cannot enforce laws. Mr. Houseman, keep your answer short because I'm over my time, but I'd love to hear you chime in.
Oh, sure. I think about Mohawk Paper out of New York. They're like a small paper producer that makes high-quality specialty papers that's represented by USW. And for us, they're competing in an international market, and they can export to a ton of countries. But should they be competing on tax policy? It's something that we firmly, the steelworkers firmly believe is the last thing that workers should be competing on. And they should be competing on the quality of the product they produce. And so that's why we're supportive of your legislation like no tax breaks for outsourcing. I think it's a strong legislative piece that shows that, when we invest in America and we ensure that we have good tax policy that holds corporations accountable for this sort of offshoring practices, we'll not only help domestic workers, but we'll help domestic companies.
Thank you. And thank you, Chairman Warren, for this important hearing. I think it's really important to remember the Mohawk Papers of America when you see an American corporation that competes with Mohawk Paper move offshore to get tax advantage to try to make Mohawk Paper's life more difficult. And there's no real competitive advantage there. It's artificial and it hurts American manufacturing. So thank you, Chairman Warren.
Thank you very much for joining us, Senator Whitehouse. A very powerful point that you make. I want to turn, if we can, for just a minute to cryptocurrency. This is another area where U.S. leadership will be key to setting the rules of the road. Cryptocurrency has created new opportunities to scam investors. Crypto has helped criminals get paid, and crypto has made the climate crisis worse. Nothing will change unless regulators step in. So let me just pick one example. Illegal financial transactions, things like online theft, drug trafficking, evading sanctions, ransomware attacks. Just last week, hackers infiltrated the networks of potentially thousands of small businesses across the world, including at least 200 American companies, and demanded $70 million in cryptocurrency, the single largest ransomware attack on record so far. Last year, criminals collected $412 million in ransom through cryptocurrency. This year, the number may turn out to be higher. So, Mr. Fanuzi, I know you're an expert on the national security implications of cryptocurrency, so I want to ask you, do you believe that cryptocurrencies are a threat to the safety and security of our financial system?
Thank you for that question, Chair Warren. I think how I would respond is that after looking at this issue for quite some time, I would say that this new internet of value that cryptocurrencies are a part of are simply a part of our economic ecosystem now. As someone who's focused on illicit finance and national security issues, it's true that I've seen multiple illicit actors, from state actors, whether it's North Korea, to non-state actors, even terrorists overseas, dabble, experiment, and gain revenue through this new technology. But so I would say that what we have to do is we have to have the framework where we see that this is not going away. Cryptocurrencies aren't going away. I think we kind of have to maybe double down on what we have done well, what the U.S. has done well. I've looked a lot at the sort of the anti-money laundering part of this. And interestingly, I think the U.S. leadership has actually been good on AML. I mean, I did a study a few years back where we compared the U.S. and other countries and how much illicit activity was happening in other regions. And even though there was an absolute value, I mean, there was maybe more in the U.S. because there was a lot of crypto activity, the percentage of illicit activity was actually smaller in the U.S. compared to other countries. And the reason is, Treasury, FinCEN specifically, had actually put out guidance about how to regulate cryptocurrency businesses. So there are still gaps, there are still issues, but I think on the AML front, we have to sort of plug the holes maybe a little bit. But I actually have seen progress on that front.
I'm very glad to hear you say that, because what I'm hearing from this is that effective regulation is possible, that the crypto risks are real, and recent ransomware attacks on Kaseya and the Colonial Pipeline may just be the tip of the iceberg here, that we need to update our anti-money laundering infrastructure to keep up. But I think what you're saying is that is possible. That is something we could do. Let me see if I can just expand our thinking about this a little. The United States has maintained leadership in global financial markets over the past century. I worry that we risk losing that competitive advantage if we don't take action to address the risks in this rapidly and growing market in crypto. So, Mr. Fanuzi, can I ask you, how important is it that the U.S. lead in writing the rules of the road when it comes to regulation of the cryptocurrency market?
Chair Warren, it's extremely important because, as I mentioned, even though I would say we've done well on a lot of the AML front, there are a lot of innovations. This technology sort of moves ahead of regulators, I would say. There are a lot of new types of applications and protocols that challenge our regulatory framework. So there are gaps there. And I would say that the big concern is that a lot of these new innovations within the crypto space could sort of either get out of hand, or the most innovation that may capitalize on some of this innovation, because it's so decentralized, could move elsewhere, could move overseas. So it's sort of important for the US to look at this technology, accept that it's really here to stay, accept that a lot of this innovation doesn't fit into some of our regulatory framework, and really figure out, really doing the tough diligence of figuring out, well, how should protocols be regulated? How should decentralized applications be regulated? What is the framework that we need to have? And I think the US is going to have to do that, or other jurisdictions may provide more opportunity for entrepreneurs.
Thank you very much. I think that's a powerful point. Cryptocurrencies are going to play a significant role in our financial system for years to come. And the United States has two options. We can set the rules of this market ourselves, or we can sit back and let other countries do it. We have an opportunity to lead the way by fostering a safe cryptocurrency market that respects privacy, but that also mitigates illicit activity and protects consumers. So I think we have real challenges in front of us on this. Thank you. Senator Brown, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and you are going to vote, I understand?
Yes, and if I'm not back,
I'll keep asking.
by the time you finish, you keep asking questions. The gavel belongs to you.
Okay,
all right.
I don't want the gavel. I just want to keep talking.
Okay, keep talking.
Right,
thank you, Senator
Madam
Brown.
Chair. Thanks for holding this hearing. And I appreciate, Madam Chair, I know this is your doing, that labor is represented in this table. So thank you for doing that. The president, I don't talk about what happens at Democratic caucuses often, but I will say today at the lunch, it was clear that President Biden puts labor at the center, workers at the center of all his policies, from trade to enforcement to wages to all that. So it's a new day in Washington, and I welcome that, and I thank Chair Warren for doing that. Let me talk about the PVLT tire case, if I could. Competitiveness starts with a level playing field. In Ohio, American steel companies like Cleveland-Cliffs are being targeted with unfair trade practices from China. I did a call today on something that should be as simple and as clean as Made in America. Made in America label, we know that company after company, most aren't, but enough are, that are cheating and slapping that label on and deceiving the buyer because they aren't products typically in many cases, and some of these cases made in Ohio. Fortunately, the Biden Federal Trade Commission has stepped up and is going to begin to enforce that much, much, much better, especially on e-commerce than has been done in the past. As we know, back to Cleveland-Cliffs, and it's not the only industry, steel, that suffers this kind of targeted dumping is rampant throughout our economy, including everything from mattresses to solar energy manufacturing. China's goal, clearly, it's their national interest. They see it that way, but their goal is to erode our industrial base. Cheating is just one way to do that. They also outright steal American IP. They exploit the loss of American innovation that occurs when a product moves overseas. I don't entirely blame the Chinese. I blame this Congress and Congresses before who have passed trade laws and tax laws that end up shutting down production in Mansfield and Ashtabula and Dayton, Ohio, and move overseas. So, Mr. Houseman, I'm glad to support the steelworkers' most recent petition for AD/CVD duties against the dumping in the U.S. Thank you for the work you're doing in that. Can you elaborate on your experience with the tire case, with the PVLT tire case?
Yes, Senator. The United Steelworkers is the largest union in tire manufacturing, representing workers across the country in PVLT tires. These are the tires that go on your car and your truck, right? And in 2014, 2015, the United Steelworkers filed a petition against China because we had 50 million tires come pumping into the US market, undercutting domestic workers, impacting over 5,000 domestic jobs. And that petition, we were successful in getting duties put in place. Now we're 5 years later, and we've seen strategic investments by China in South Korea, in Thailand, and other countries where we've seen significant increases in PVLT tire imports. So much so that in the last year, the United Steelworkers, because they have this union density and are able to file trade cases, they filed a new petition against South Korea, Thailand, Taiwan, and Vietnam. And we're successful in that petition, and we thank you, Senator, for sending a letter in support of that petition. But this became this whole point of whack-a-mole, right? Where, we stopped investment, we stopped dumping from China, but now China is now investing in these third-party countries and now dumping into the U.S. market again, all over again. So this whack-a-mole issue is one of the reasons why we're supportive of your legislation, the Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0, because we have to hold China's Belt and Road Initiative accountable in our trade enforcement laws.
Let me take that a bit different direction. I'm going to go way over my 5 minutes because nobody else is here to stop me. So I was talking to a tire manufacturer last night who said that I'm not sure I fully understand, and you can expand, or any other person on the panel can. Apparently, he said that the tire retread market production is down. We don't have the ability, we've lost jobs in retreading tires because cheap Chinese tires don't have the base to be able to retread, while American tires, Goodyear and Akron, for instance, and others, Bridgestone, others, can actually provide the base tire, the core tire, whatever the term is. I apologize for my ignorance, to do that. Is that generally right? Can you comment on that?
From a top level, yes. Our members make, they call them off-the-road tires. These are the big tires that go on tractors, for example. And, you know, from our membership and what we've heard is that they do some of this retreading work. And what we have heard is that, yeah, these Chinese imports, they're of a lower quality and you can't actually do this retread work. So ultimately, like the energy and all the effort that's expended here, you aren't able to even recycle this product, right? And I think that that's why.
Or reuse is the better word,
yeah.
right? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Spriggs, I assume you're here. I don't see you,
Yeah.
but you were on the screen. Okay, good to see you.
Thank you.
Connection to Oberlin College, nice to see you. Ohio workers have paid the price, as you know, Dr. Spriggs, for previous administration policies that eroded our manufacturing industrial base. This administration has a different approach. I want to work with them to make sure investments in R&D and manufacturing and clean energy, in particular, translate into good-paying union jobs for Ohio workers. It means making investments in the first place to undo the decades of harm to these industries. It also means passing the Protect the Right to Organize Act to make sure workers have a voice in the workplace. Dr. Spriggs, explain what the erosion, this is this potentially is a really long answer, make it as short as you can, but explain what the erosion of American manufacturing has done to our economy and what we do about it moving forward.
It's created, thank you for the question, Senator. It's created this hollowing out of our communities. The impact isn't just to the immediate workers who lose their jobs to trade, but it's to their communities. And so if I did a map and colored red where we have an increase in joblessness, you would see that map light up very heavily in Ohio. But in other places where we know this big impact of the loss of jobs because of trade, it means we have to re-envision trade adjustment assistance to understand we must also help communities. Money needs to go for active labor market policies at the worker level so that we can ensure the community can generate enough jobs to make up for the jobs lost, and especially target on young people. We need to have an expansion of WIOA investments in youth training and youth job opportunities, because that's who gets hurt when we lose these jobs, in addition to the workers who are immediately impacted. And this slowdown that took place between 2000 and 2008 with the massive expansion and shock of the China trade had implications going even to the recovery that we had from the Great Recession.
Thank you. And when you say using the term hollowing out is a tragic sort of term when you look how it applies in real life. I know that people on this panel and people watching will know, just sort of intuitively understand what's happening to Cleveland and Dayton and Youngstown and Toledo. And really Cincinnati and Columbus, perhaps a bit less so. But they won't have heard of so many of the mid-sized towns in my state, where I grew up: Mansfield, Lima, Chillicothe, Springfield, Ravenna, in smaller towns like Defiance and Fremont, and that have Canton, a little larger city, that have lost so many good industrial jobs. Where I grew up was a union town, where a working class city, where a lot of kids I went to high school with had futures and had opportunity because they could get good paying union jobs. At Westinghouse at one point had 8,000 manufacturing jobs. General Motors had 5,000. Mansfield Tire had 2,000. Gorman Rupp, Borg Warner, company after company after company. So you're exactly right when you talk about the hollowing out. My last question for Dr. Spriggs is for you. You spoke in your testimony about the importance of family policy as infrastructure, not the narrow definition, as important as it is, water, sewer, bridges, highways, but a broader definition of housing and education and broadband and childcare and the child tax credit. All what is tell me what the expanded child tax credit, which the checks will go out this week. People will see in their mailboxes this week, probably tomorrow, or direct deposit. What's that going to mean to working families?
It's going to be very important to working families on both sides of the equation when it comes to childcare. So we can make childcare affordable to all families, and affordable so that the workers in the industry can finally get the kind of wages that they need to help their families. And so that's why it's so important. We need to increase the labor force participation of American women. We cannot go forward with our population growing older, the population in the United States shrinking, without increasing the labor force participation of women to respond to that. We rank sixth among the G7 nations when it comes to women labor force participation. And as a result of this pandemic, we were pushed back to 1985 for women's labor force participation. We've only made it back to 1988. We cannot continue without having paid leave, without having childcare, and without helping families pay for childcare so that the workers in the industry can get decent wages.
Thank you, Dr. Spriggs. Senator Cassidy, thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you all. I'm sorry to be going so long. It's just been an incredibly hectic day. Ms. Nakano, one thing that has struck me, you mentioned about the increasing greenhouse gas emissions from China. And one thing that has occurred to me is that as the EU and the United States ratchet down emissions, it only encourages some high polluting enterprises to move to China. Would you agree with that assessment?
Thank you so much for your question, Senator. I think that generally without proper protections, yes, a lot of high emission-intensive manufacturing could move to China. And my understanding is that is why at least the EU is very much interested in coming up with the border carbon adjustment and other measures to ensure that these goods that are manufactured in countries with less than desired level of environmental protections will not then be exported back to societies and economies that do have stringent.
So let me interrupt you, please, just because we have
protection.
limited time.
Sure.
The point I made in my opening statement is that the requirement by the U.S. of certain environmental and labor standards in CAFTA-DR, USMCA, Colombia Free Trade Agreement, et cetera, effectively works as a subsidy if China chooses to ignore those standards, therefore does not incur the cost of compliance, and that works against our interest in a variety of ways. Would you agree with that?
So I do not follow trade policy and agreements closely enough to really have.
Then let me phrase it differently.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I assume that the reason that coal is being used is that coal is and particularly if you're not putting in scrubbers for SOx and NOx, that is the cheapest form of electricity that can be generated. Is that a correct statement?
Yes, coal-fired power plants without proper, equipment could be cheapest. Although, if I may add, China does have fairly high SOx and NOx and also particulate matter limitations.
Now, it tells me, though, that I
about
think,
half a decade ago.
don't I know from, I think I've seen some air quality data that shows that China builds their coal-fired plants on their Pacific seaboard, and that the trade winds blow it away from China over to the U.S. West Coast. I was also told by somebody who's a native of Seoul that they have a lot of particulate matter that blows into South Korea from China. So when you mention that they have, these stringent standards, are those stringent standards enforced?
The enforcement has always been a challenge. Yes, whether it's the environmental or even more of a health side of issues that are associated with many of the energy production activities that take place in China.
Thank you. Mr. Fanuzi, I'm interested, Mr. Luna, in my last set of questions with Mr. Luna, and we were speaking about how there might be common ground in U.S.-China relations in terms of stopping capital flight. To what degree, could, using cryptocurrency, because I understand there's some cryptocurrencies that actually, whereas you typically think of it as a way to money launder or otherwise move dollars that shouldn't be moved in a certain fashion, there are some cryptos that actually allow for legitimate transactions, if you will, those that can be traced, those that can be insured not to be tied to the illicit economy. Do I understand that correctly?
I think you're in the right direction in that, yeah, so natively cryptocurrencies are usually, anonymous or maybe pseudonymous. There's no identity connected to them. And the way that we address that issue from a regulatory perspective is that we ensure that places where people purchase cryptocurrencies, that those places, those websites, we call them exchanges, that they are regulated, that they are places where they follow anti-money laundering rules, and that users, customers have to go through a process to be vetted and identified.
Now, what I don't understand, sir, and I'm asking this just, I don't know the answer, I just want to learn from the expert.
Sure.
Why would a bad person choose to use that sort of exchange as opposed to another exchange which would allow them to remain anonymous?
No, you're absolutely right. They often would prefer to. The challenge is that there are lots of jurisdictions that aren't regulating their exchanges. So you're right. I mean, sometimes bad actors do go to the regulated exchange. They'll often do it because there's more liquidity there. It's easier to use.
So I think I read, though, in your testimony or someone's that China, with their cheap hydroelectric, is a place where Bitcoin people specifically go to mine. Does that give China more insight into, I don't understand the process, because people mine Bitcoin in China, does that give China a greater ability to monitor the transactions?
Well, the thing that's happening in China is actually China is actually cracking down on the mining, and it actually maybe relates to your conversation with Mr. Luna, because there's a lot of capital flight. China has actually been threatened by the cryptocurrency trading sector. So really the past couple of years, China has tried to stamp them out, and they're actually in the middle of a big crackdown. And miners are actually leaving because China is even cracking down on mining. So I think you're actually going to see a lot of the crypto activity that's happening in China, just because of what the Chinese regulators want. A lot of it is going to leave, maybe elsewhere in the region. And so the key probably is to get others in the region to make sure that they're regulating, because if people can't do exchanges in China, they're going to go to other parts of Asia to do that activity.
Well, I'm about to sign this back over to Chair Warren, and I've been kind of stretched today, I have to leave once more. But my question for the record for you, Dr. Gallagher and Mr. Luna, is if there's an opportunity to cooperate with China on the issue of cryptocurrency being used for illicit financing from their perspective from capital flight, is there some way that we can suggest that we work together? I mean, China's a little bit of a frenemy, and I want the accent to be on the fre and not on the enemy. And so if there's a way that we could collaborate, I would love to think about that, and you three are the ones who are the experts on that. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Chair Warren. Chair Warren, I am supposed to be someplace else now again, but I thank you for co-hosting this, and I thank you to all the witnesses for your testimony, which I read, and each one of you has just really fabulous testimony, so thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it, Ranking Member Cassidy. And I know it's been a tough day with the ins and outs, but we've still gotten a chance to hear from good people and ask some good questions. Yes. So, good. I'm going to ask one more round of questions, if you all will bear with me. I want to talk about, once again, what are the elements of building a stronger economy, competing with China. Too often in Congress, the metric for whether we're making the United States stronger and more competitive in the world gets reduced to the number of bombers, submarines, and missiles we have compared with China or another country. And the U.S. buys a lot of bombers, submarines, and missiles. Real investment in American competitiveness would mean spending federal dollars on things that help families succeed economically. This year, women's workforce participation hit the lowest levels since 1988. 26% of women who became unemployed this year said that it was due to a lack of childcare. And understand, this problem was highlighted during the pandemic, but the problem has been out there for a long time. Dr. Spriggs, the United States does not have any program to provide affordable, quality childcare to every family who needs it. Is that how other wealthy countries handle this?
Thank you for that question, Senator. Yes, the answer to your question is our competitors learned long ago that infrastructure means how do I get to work? How is it that I'm able to show up in the economy? That doesn't mean roads and bridges only. For many workers, it means, do I have childcare? Do I have help with my parents? Do I have elder care help? They understood this a long time ago because they took seriously that their populations were slowing in terms of population growth. And they understood to get people to work means more than roads and bridges. It means the whole infrastructure, the rules and everything that goes with supporting getting people to work. So it means you have to have access to high quality childcare, elder care, and you must have paid family leave. That is why we are sixth out of the 7 G7 nations. They have those policies. We do not. Those two policies, paid leave and help with child care, are the two best known policies for increasing women's labor force participation. We don't do either.
Well, that is very powerful. You know, when we don't have child care, elder care, paid family leave, women's workforce participation suffers. Children who need it can't get quality care. It's too expensive, and providers are paid too little, so that we have a workforce that is barely scraping by and has high turnover, doing some of the most important work in our nation. Our failure to support working families, and especially working women, has left the U.S. behind. And we're not just falling behind countries like Canada. We're also undermining exactly the qualities that make our workforce competitive with China. So, Dr. Gallagher, let me come back to you. China's always going to have more workers than we have. China can pay their workers less, and they can spend less on benefits and provide fewer protections for their workers. So just bring this together by talking about what is American workers' competitive advantage compared with the Chinese workforce?
Well, in my written statement and also earlier, I did talk a lot about the challenges that China will face related to its own workforce, particularly the rural-urban inequality. American workers are better educated, they are more productive, and there are far less government restrictions on our choices, how many children we would like to have, where we'd like to work and settle down. Access to good schools, good jobs, good neighborhoods is not based on the town my parents came from, though we do still have significant problems and challenges that I wouldn't ignore related to race and other factors. We also cannot rest on our laurels because China is aware of the problems that it faces and is trying to address them. We need to invest and further improve every child's right to a good education and access to college. Automation and rapidly changing technology require that we invest in basic academic skills. We also need to invest in childcare that is essential to a functioning and flexible labor market in a dynamic economy. And as a working woman and a mother who has worked both in China and the United States, I have struggled to often find the childcare that I need. So I appreciate the attention to the problem.
Yeah.
Thank you, Senator Warren.
I appreciate it too. I think of our advantages. We have a workforce that is more diverse, a workforce that is better educated, and a workforce that is more skilled. But in order to build on those advantages, we have got to make investments in our people. Those advantages are not accidental. They didn't fall out of the sky. They are the results of direct investment in education, in workers' rights. Public schools are free to every family, no matter how much or how little money they make, no matter where they live. In the 20th century, we made high school universal, and we invested to make sure that motivated students could go to community college or a public university, get an excellent education without drowning in debt. These investments have frayed over the past several decades, and we have a lot of work to do to restore their promise. But they gave us the most educated and skilled workforce in the world, and that workforce helped us build the strongest economy in the world. Now we are falling behind, especially when it comes to investing in our littlest ones. So let me just ask you, you'll get the last word here, Dr. Gallagher. How does our failure to support working families with childcare undermine the advantages that we have built up in our workforce vis-a-vis our competition with China and others?
Well, I think it's, in some ways, the problems that we face are very similar to the problem that Chinese families face. The lack of access to childcare means that mothers, particularly mothers who struggle to find childcare and do more household work than men, particularly in China, drop out of the workforce when they can't afford it or locate it. So it hobbles a large proportion of our working population at a time when we cannot risk it. Like China, we face also low fertility rates. We face an aging society. And when women or men, for that matter, drop out of the workforce, it's because they cannot afford good childcare, our human capital is underutilized. So it's not just that workers' individual choices are thwarted, it can hurt the entire economy.
Yeah. I'll say it again. Childcare is infrastructure. It supports our whole economy. I am fighting for universal, high-quality, available childcare that will make sure that every child that needs it has access to it, and that people who are childcare workers will be paid the wages that they deserve. Investing in American competitiveness means more than boosting semiconductor production and funding research and development. It means more than buying more missiles and more submarines. It means making broad-based investments in American workers and families, including childcare. That's how we're going to keep up with our peers. That's how we're going to stay competitive with countries like China, and that's how we're going to build a future for all of our people. So I just want to thank every one of you for being here today, those who could come in person, those who joined us virtually. For senators who wish to submit questions for the record, those questions are due 1 week from today. That's Wednesday, June 21st. For our witnesses, you will have 45 days to respond to any questions. Again, thank you very much for coming. Thanks for sharing your expertise. We really do appreciate it. This hearing is adjourned.